When I received the Picture in the South commission from the High Museum, I was in the midst of doing projects using the 20 by 24 Polaroid camera and working with young people, trying to bring young people into my practice, both as the subjects of the work, but also to make the work accessible to them, to sort of demystify the way in which an artist works by making them a very active part of the process. That work was very logistically complicated because I was working with this 265-pound camera that requires a technician, it requires a place to set up backdrops, it requires a place to set up studio lighting, and that's usually in a photo studio. And because it was going to be inside, it was kind of clear that I couldn't bring a literal description of the geography of the South to the work, but I did want to try to find a way to push the work forward in some way. When I started making the 20 by 24 Polaroid portraits in the studio, I started making them as single images. The work was originally very much informed by my experience of having seen some of Rembrandt's work when I was in grade school. I had to do a report on Rembrandt. So I suppose I was in a good grade school. And I fell in love with the work, and I never forgot the work. And that was initially what I drew from when I went into the studio for the first time, after having been photographing exclusively in the natural environment and in the streets. So I started off with single images, a singular light source, very similar to the singular light source in Rembrandt's work, and this kind of heightened sense of presence. And even though 20 by 24 is large, I began to want to make something that had even more of a physical presence. So I went from the single image to the diptych, and that began to introduce the idea of time into the photograph. It kind of freed me from the constraints of the idea that a photograph needed to be a single image. And then as I began to want to give the young people in front of the camera an even more monumental presence, I began to think about how to actually build the picture and how to extend even further the very real aspect of time that goes into the making of those photographs. I started by moving the camera closer in order to emphasize even more what the subject looked like physically, to heighten the sense of physical and material description. And of course, when you get closer, you're not only showing something in greater detail, but you're leaving a lot out. And so in order to put back into the photographs what was being left out by getting closer, I started to move the camera around the subject to kind of build the picture in a way that literally took, in some cases, 2 hours, which requires a significant degree of patience and participation on the part of the subject, whom once they strike whatever the pose is, basically have to hold that until the whole piece is made. For me, the South has always been both a mythic place and a tragic place. Tragic in that the South is the place where the formative relationship between African Americans and this country begins. The tension between the violent history and the beautiful landscape. Because it's a really beautiful place. And it is a beautiful place where at one time there was very little that could be called beautiful about it, certainly in the social sense. The older one gets, I'd like to think, you gain enough perspective to be able to look back in a way that is richer and more informed.